Hey, hello friends. We're continuing our journey to the cross as now we're moving closer and closer to Holy Week, Good Friday, Resurrection Sunday. What a beautiful season it is. Even the weather is starting to spruce up and it kind of feels like spring out there. A few things just to remind you of as we continue our study. Make sure you're doing the readings in our Journey to the Cross booklet that has all those readings in John's Gospel. This week's lesson is looking at week number 3. We're getting into John chapter 7, 8, and 9. Some incredible stories there. And then also be aware of our prayer guide at the end, doing that united in prayer time as you're praying at 5:17 each day and remembering that. So the first couple of weeks we prayed for our life group leaders. We prayed for women and men's ministry, for Melody, for David Alexander. This week looking at Pastor Ryan, our college ministries, and also if you would remember Pastor Jerry and all of our senior adult ministries as well. A lot of great things that are happening there. So those are some of the things that are going on. And just to be reminded, pick up some of those cards that we have in the foyer at the church to invite your neighbors, invite your friends and family to be with us for Easter Sunday as well as for Good Friday and that whole Holy Week. Remember, we got 3 services that will be happening on Easter Sunday. Also, those of you in life groups, we want to make sure you're aware of on Saturday, April 12th, that evening, 6 to 7:30 in the youth room, we'll be doing a first century Passover night. It's an opportunity for us to remember the Last Supper that Jesus had that was a Passover meal with his disciples. And so ask your group leader about that because I'll be sending them a special link that hasn't been made public to the whole church yet because there's only 150 spots. So my hope is that groups will come together and be able to sit, even bring your family and be a part of that. All right, let's get into our study for this week as we continue our journey to the cross. We've been looking at how John uses sevens. 7 times Jesus says, I am. 7 miracles that he does. Very much like John uses in Revelation, he does the same in his gospel. So we're now up to a couple of incredible stories this week we're looking at. Now remember, one of the things that John wants his readers to know is that Jesus really is God in the flesh. So he's dropping these stories that sometimes the other Gospels don't even mention because they highlight that message of Jesus actually being God with us. One of these is the story that we find in John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. In your group, you're going to be reading from that story in John 8. And even though it's not one of our I am statements or one of our miracle stories, it is an incredible story of Jesus actually making the claim in John's gospel of being God with us. In this case, you know the story of the woman is brought and she's been caught in adultery. Now, as we look at the law of Moses that we find in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, it actually tells us that both the woman and the man are to be stoned for the crime of adultery. So it's possible that the guy is out in the Kidron Valley already being taken care of or something, but we don't know. In this case, the woman has been brought and the question is given to Jesus about what should be done. Now, you're going to read that story in your group, but here's what I want to highlight in that. In that story, Jesus stoops and writes with his finger on the ground. Now, I know sometimes, we picture that story, or maybe even it's expressed in movies and things of like the dusty streets, almost like high noon in the western town. The religious leaders come and Jesus is like, what are you fellers doing? It's not quite like that. In fact, John's gospel tells us it takes place in the temple courts. So the temple is not a dusty street, it's stone. And it's within the stone pavers there that are in the temple courts. So what's interesting is when Jesus is asked about how the law of Moses should be applied, he stoops down and writes with his finger on the ground. Interesting detail. Is there something in that? Well, it reminds us of the fact that in Exodus 31:18, at the very end of God giving all of the laws to Moses on Mount Sinai to bring to the people, he then gives to Moses the tablets of the law written with the finger of God. When Jesus stoops down and begins to write with his finger, John is wanting us to pay attention. It's the very law of God being written by the finger of God, but this time it's Jesus. All right, you're going to explore that in your group when you read about that story. We also have a couple of incredible I am statements. So we're looking at the second of Jesus' I am statements in John chapter 8, right after that story of the woman. In this case, Jesus is again in the temple courts. It tells us that in John 8:20, that all of this happened in the temple. In fact, it designates that it's in the place of the temple near the treasury. The treasury was a part of the inner court of the temple, an area called the court of the women. And if we read carefully the stories of John 6, 7, and 8, it tells us that Jesus was there in the wintertime around the time of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, which is also the Feast of Dedication. In fact, the word Hanukkah in Hebrew means dedication. Well, something that we don't have in the New Testament, but other Jewish literature of the time tells us, during the Feast of Hanukkah, in the court of the women, there would be a massive menorah that would be set up. And this massive menorah would be a reminder of the story of Hanukkah. The story of when the Maccabees had retaken the temple from the Greeks that had confiscated it, and they relit the menorah and rededicated the temple. Now, when we lived in Israel, there was one very similar to this. This menorah actually stands in front of the Knesset, which is the Jewish Congress building. It would be like in Washington, D.C. But this is a 12-foot tall menorah that reminds us of the great menorah that stood in the temple courts at the time of Jesus. The menorah not only represented the presence of God's Spirit, but it also hearkened back to a couple of passages that are on your handout this week. In Isaiah chapter 42, God says that his people would be a light unto the nations, and that light of the nations would be through his commandments. We also have in Zechariah chapter 4, Zechariah the prophet sees a vision of a menorah, and that menorah represents the Spirit of God. And even in that teaching, Zechariah is told, not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. Okay, so we put all these strands together. By the time that Jesus is visiting the temple, the people regarded that menorah as not only representing the time of Hanukkah and the celebration of the Hanukkah festival, but also that God's Word, God's commandments, would be a light to the world, teaching them about the character of God. In the middle of that, Jesus stands in the court of the temple and says, I am the light of the world. Jesus is saying that the goodness of God, the commandments of God that are going to be a blessing to all the nations of the world are summed up in his person. He is the light of the world. You're going to be reading that passage in your group. Now, Jesus also gives his third and fourth statements combined into one in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, he's giving the illustration of the people being like sheep, the people who need a shepherd. And so Jesus makes two very interesting statements of I am. He says, I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. In your group, you're going to be reading some of those passages from John chapter 10. But let's unpack a little bit of what the people would be hearing when Jesus talks about that. First of all, the idea of being the door of the sheep. In the ancient world, the places where a shepherd would bring his sheep overnight to be protected would be something like this. And you can see that there's an opening and then there's a high wall. That high wall, first of all, means that the sheep won't wander off during the night. It also means that predators can't get in. And then you have, as illustrated here, the shepherd would actually lay down and sleep in that narrow opening. It meant that the sheep couldn't escape without walking over him, nor could any predators get in without first going through the shepherd himself. The shepherd literally became the door to the sheepfold. So when Jesus says, I am the door of the sheep, he is saying he's going to lay down his own life for the sake of the sheep. He is going to battle against the spiritual forces of darkness and give his very life for the life of the sheep. But then he goes on to say, I am the good shepherd. Now, how would that have been heard by Jesus' hearers that hear him talking about being the good shepherd? They would have been reminded of Ezekiel chapter 34. In Ezekiel 34, the prophet Ezekiel is speaking to the shepherds of Israel. But in that case, he's talking about the religious leaders, the high priests, the ones who are supposed to be looking out for the sheep of Israel. And God challenges them and says, you've taken care of yourself and not cared for the sheep. You have left them without a shepherd. So God makes an interesting prophetic promise through Ezekiel and says, I will become the shepherd of the sheep. I will send one in my name who will be the good shepherd. He even says in Ezekiel, this shepherd will be descended from David, and he will be the one that cares for the sheep. So there's a lot going on in this. First of all, it helps us understand the calling of the shepherds in the Christmas story. It's almost as if God said, well, if the shepherds of Israel, the religious leaders, aren't going to come and worship the Messiah, I'll just call my own shepherds. He goes to the fields where David used to watch over sheep and says, come and visit my shepherd that is being sent. And now Jesus in John 10 says, I am the good shepherd. And it makes the priests get really mad at him. No wonder. Jesus is quoting from Ezekiel 34 and basically saying, you religious leaders have not been good shepherds, so God has sent me to be the good shepherd. All of this brings us back to Jesus is the one who lays down his life for us. Jesus is the one who reaches out to us with grace and mercy, even when we make mistakes. Jesus is the good shepherd who has been sent to us to bring us back into God's fold where we can be protected, where we can be cared for. So as you continue journeying to the cross, I pray that your group will really enjoy looking at these passages that highlight who Jesus is for us. May God be with you in your readings this week.